Hello and welcome to another edition of Catholic Teachings by the Deacons. So tonight's topic is St. Thomas Aquinas, the Angelic Doctor. Now if you remember my last talk, if you happen to watch that, it was on St. Albert the Great, another doctor of the church. And if you remember me talking about St. Albert the Great, he was one of the teachers of St. Thomas Aquinas. So they were contemporaries, they knew each other, and they had similar interests in philosophy and theology and things of that nature. And they were also both Dominicans. So I found it proper just to follow up with the St. Albert the Great talk with a talk on his student, St. Thomas Aquinas. Now I have to admit that when I decided to do that, I really didn't think too much about it, just that it made sense. But when I started preparing for this, I realized that I had set up quite a daunting task for myself. Because St. Thomas Aquinas has done so much, written so many things that have influenced so many areas of not just our faith and our church, but the entire world. And so it's a very difficult task, especially to wrap up, within one of these hour-long talks. But I believe it's important to have at least a basic understanding of not just the works of St. Thomas Aquinas, the impact he made on the world, but also of who he was, the man he was, and what makes him such a great saint. So I'm going to attempt here tonight to give you a brief overview of his life and dive a little bit, we can't go too deep obviously, into some of his more important works and his writings and his doctrines. And so we'll see how this goes and we'll see if I'm successful in doing this or not. So the impact of St. Thomas Aquinas cannot be underestimated. He is easily, one of the top 10 thinkers in the history of the world. And probably I'd put him in the top 5 most influential and important people in the Western world since, the written language. His writings have impacted so many genres, so many areas of our lives and our daily lives. Things like human rights, he's influential in that, in natural law, politics, international law, philosophy, and of course, theology. Now, it's impossible for me to talk about everything in all the ways that St. Thomas Aquinas did or influenced us in 1 hour. So all I can barely do is just barely scratch the surface of this. Because many of his ideas, quite honest, are just hard to understand. I mean, people go and get doctorates in just his teachings and his writings, Thomists. They'll spend a lifetime just trying to understand St. Thomas Aquinas and go deeper into it. So really my goal tonight, is, like I said, is to give you a basic understanding of who St. Thomas was and why he is so important, not just to the church, to our faith, but to the world. I'll touch on a few of his more important principles later on, and also give you an idea of how these principles influence us in our world today. First, a little bit about St. Thomas Aquinas himself. So Thomas was born in the Italian city of Aquino around 1225 AD. So Aquinas is not actually his last name. It's a reference to where he was born, in Aquino. And that's how it was back then. They didn't have last names. You were referred to as Thomas of Aquino. His last came his name. He was born to a kind of upper middle class family. They had a castle, so it's kind of well-off family. And so he was sent to a Benedictine monastery at an early age to be an oblate, to study to be a monk. Because he was in a rather large family, he was one of 7 sons, and was typical in that time in Europe. The older sons would go and be politicians, knights. They would run the estate. They would be heirs to the family title. And then the younger sons would all go and become monks and priests and bishops and things of that nature. So St. Thomas, being one of the younger sons, this was expected, that he would be sent to a monastery at an early age to train to become a monk. Later on, he would continue his studies at the University of Naples. Thomas would then join the Dominicans. And just a note here, in 1245, he studied at the University of Paris under St. Albert the Great. Remember my talk on St. Albert, who was a teacher, a master there, and he taught St. Thomas Aquinas for a short while. Now, if you also remember from my discussion about St. Albert the Great, the Dominican order at this time, in around 1220s, was a very young, new, upstart religious order. They had only been founded 9 years before Thomas's birth, founded by, obviously, St. Dominic. So they're not well established, not well known. They were seen at that time as still kind of eccentric because they begged for the food. They would not ride horses or carriages or things of that nature. And so they were kind of these odd, monks who kind of roamed around the place. The Benedictines, at the other hand, were a very well-established order, having founded, many, many years ago by St. Benedict in Nursia. And so they had monasteries all throughout Europe at that time, and it was very well-established, very well-known order, the Benedictine order. So Thomas's parents wanted him to be part of a well-established order. And that's what caused the problems, because then he ran off and joined the Dominicans, these young upstarts who were a little bit on the odd side at the time. So his family did not like that. They were not pleased with him joining the Dominican order, so they did what any good, normal family would do. They kidnapped and imprisoned him in their home. Yes, they kidnapped him from the Dominican monastery, and they imprisoned him in their home in the castle, up in the castle where he could not get out. And he was imprisoned in his room, and that's where he stayed for a long time. Then, on top of that, when he would not acquiesce, actually he enjoyed being the time alone. He got time to study, time to read and pray. He actually, converted his sister and got her to want to join the Dominican sister order. And so his brothers decided let's go one step further. And they decided to try to get St. Thomas to break his vow of celibacy, which would require him to leave then the Dominican order. So, not quite thinking, they hired a prostitute and put her in his locked room. St. Thomas, to maintain his virtue, knew that he was in trouble, so what he did is that he grabbed a hot poker out of the fire, and brandishing it, he chased her out of his room. She ran out screaming, and then she closed the door behind her. St. Thomas then took the poker and he burned a cross and burn marks on the door with the poker. His family got the hint from this, and they finally gave up. They let Thomas out, and he went and returned to the Dominicans. And there he would stay in the Dominican order for the rest of his life. Speaking of the rest of his life, it is rather uneventful after this event. Unlike St. Albert the Great, who roamed all about Europe and was, a negotiator, and he was a preacher for the Crusades, and he was all these different things he taught at many different universities, and was preaching to the Pope in Rome and things like that. St. Thomas did not do much of that. His life was rather uneventful. He taught at a few universities, the University of Naples, the University of Paris. One other names escape me. But he spent most of his time studying and writing, giving homilies, writing in his works, and just being St. Thomas. As a result, he has many, many writings, most of which we still have today. It's hard to kind of summarize everything because there's so many writings, many commentaries in the Bible, commentaries in Aristotle, sermons, prayers. But three of his most famous works is, first of all, the Aquinas Catechism, which is fascinating because it is a catechism of the Catholic Church, and it focuses on the Ten Commandments. It focuses on the Creed, the sacraments, and prayers like the Our Father and Hail Mary, much like our catechism of today. But St. Thomas, we didn't have that catechism back then, so he decided to write his own. Next one is Asuma contra Gentiles. This was written as a handbook for teachers of the faith, basically RE teachers at the time, and for also defenders of the faith. It kind of gave them the background, what they needed to know to teach the faith, as well as kind of apologetics in a way to defend the faith against non-Christians. But probably his greatest work, the work he's most well known for, is the Summa Theologiae, also called the Summa Theologica. This is what he called basically the summary of theology, although as a summary, it's a very, very large document. It's actually 3 volumes, and we'll talk about more about the Summa Theologiae later. But it is kind of his crowning achievement, and it is a summary of our faith, although St. Thomas apparently had a problem with summaries because the summary of our faith is actually quite long. Could be more of a compendium of our faith. But we'll talk more about the Summa, as it's typically referred to, just Summa. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But it cannot be understated just how brilliant St. Thomas was. He had this amazing gift of memory, of memorization. He had a particular method he used to memorize things as well. It was said that while he was imprisoned in his room in the castle by his family, while he was there, because he had a lot of time on his hands, he decided he memorized the entire Bible. That's just how much of a gift and how genius he actually was. He memorized the entire Bible. At his peak of his writing, he was producing an average of 4,000 words in his books every single day. To give you kind of a reference, even a really good, prolific author can probably write 500, maybe 1,000 if they're being really good, a day. But he did 4,000. So he was just very prolific. How did he do this? He would do this by, he would have several scribes, 3 or 4 scribes, surround him in a room, different parts of the room, and then he would walk around to each scribe and he would dictate to one a few sentences, who was writing in one chapter of the book. He'd walk to the next scribe, dictate to that scribe a few sentences from another chapter in his book, and then the third scribe the same thing, and he'd just keep going round and around the room, all never losing track of where he was and continually dictating to them all, giving them time to write everything down, so that by the time he came around again, they were ready for him to give him more. Which is a good thing, because actually St. Thomas has horrible, atrocious handwriting. It's been said that there's only a few people in the world who can actually read St. Thomas's writing. It is so bad. So although he was gifted and well, just super intelligent, he probably would have failed penmanship class. Another interesting thing about St. Thomas is that he's noted as being a rather large individual. And so his Dominican brothers, to kind of help him in his writings and help him study, made a table for him where they cut out a semicircle at the edge of the middle of the table so that St. Thomas could basically fit his girth in there and have full access to the table. So he was a rather large individual. He loved to eat. What has survived of his writings encompasses about a total of 20,000 pages and about 50 volumes. So a lot of writing was done. Now, St. Thomas, in his many writings, he would not restrict himself to just Christian Catholic writers. He's well known for drawing from many writings, whether it include Aristotle or the Muslim or the Jewish philosophers. And this was groundbreaking at the time. At that time, it was kind of, forbidden to go outside of the church to write about philosophy or theology. But St. Thomas did this in a way that he showed how these non-Christian and sometimes pagan philosophers had ideas, had parts of the truth that would contribute and actually enhance our own understanding of our own faith. He, like St. Albert the Great, who also did this, they were both experts on Aristotle. And St. Thomas Aquinas, like St. Albert the Great did before him, wrote commentaries on all of Aristotle's works. Very prolific writer. So in 1273, St. Thomas was praying in the St. Nicholas Chapel in Naples, in the Naples convent, when a sacristan, he was praying alone. there before the crucifix. A sacristan just happened to be there kind of, finishing up after Mass or something. And he observed St. Thomas there praying and weeping before the crucifix. And then the sacristan states that he saw St. Thomas then levitate before the crucifix. Then he heard the words of Christ speaking to Thomas. Well, Christ says, "You have written well of me, Thomas. What reward do you have for your labor?" And Thomas so beautifully answers, "Nothing but you, Lord." It's a very beautiful moment. It's a good way of understanding what makes St. Thomas a saint. And that he did not ask for any wishes or grants or any specialties for his works and for his labor. He wanted nothing but Jesus Christ, which is just a beautiful way. This should be an example. It should be a thing for all of us, no matter, despite our labors in our lives, whatever we do, what we should really only desire is Jesus. Later that same year, on December 6th, Thomas had another mystical experience. This time, while he was saying Mass, he was caught up in ecstasy. And it was a moment that people perceived and noticed where he kind of paused during the Mass and was just caught up in this very mystical experience. What actually happened, St. Thomas would never say. He never actually told anybody what happened. But something did happen. Because after that Mass, after that moment, St. Thomas never wrote another word. He completely stopped writing, completely. And when asked about it, Thomas simply replied, "I cannot, because all that I have written seems like straw to me." So apparently he had some kind of experience where he was seen, he had a mystical experience in the presence of God, and he realized that what he said earlier about "nothing but you, Lord," was the truth. He did not need to do anything except pursue Christ. And so he never wrote another word, and he left his greatest work, the Asuma theologia, unfinished. Part 3, which is the final part of it, was not finished and never would be. Now, interesting thing, just a note, is that I find it interesting that the first experience that St. Thomas had in the chapel was in the chapel of St. Nicholas. And the second experience happened on December 6th, which happens to be the feast day of St. Nicholas. Coincidence? I don't know. Maybe St. Nicholas had something to do with this as well? Who knows? Finally, his death and his canonization. So as you know, when I talked about St. Albert, I had a lot of things to talk about his life because he did so many different things. But when we get to St. Thomas, he wrote, he preached, he said Mass, he read, but that was the majority of his life. And so there's not a whole lot to talk about his life, except for his mystical experiences, a few of those, and kind of the hot poker incidents. But we have a lot to talk about when we start talking about his works. But before that, let's talk about his death. So on March 7th, 1274, St. Thomas Aquinas died from brain trauma from striking his head on a tree branch. Now, we never know if he struck it while riding, a donkey or a horse or something like that, or if he tripped and fell and hit his head on a tree branch on the ground or on the tree or something like that. We don't know. But we don't actually know if he died from that because his death will actually come many months later after that event. But he was just never quite right after that head trauma. And so the suspicion is that he has some kind of blood clot or blood flow in his brain that caused him later on to die. And so then on his last words were recorded as, "I receive the ransom of my soul. For love of thee have I studied and kept vigil, toiled, preached, and taught." Those were St. Thomas's last words. And then on July 18th, 1323, Pope John XII would pronounce St. Thomas a saint. And then Pope Pius V declared St. Thomas a doctor of the Church in 1567. He would be called a universal doctor of the Church, in which that he would apply to all of the Church in the entire world as well, which is true because his contributions go beyond just the Church. St. Thomas's remains are currently at the church of the Jacobins in Toulouse, France. And you see here, this is a picture of the tomb of St. Thomas Aquinas in that church in France. And finally, his feast day is January 28th. So we just had his feast day 3 weeks ago. Okay, this is where the talk is going to start to get heavy, because I'm going to start getting a little bit into his writings. I'm going to cover some of St. Thomas's more popular ideas, and some of it is going to be complex. So I hope that I'm able to describe these things accurately and well enough that you can at least kind of understand what I'm talking about. And on top of that, I have limited time. I have about 40 minutes to do this, so I cannot go deep really into any of it. And so if I talk about something and you find that interesting, I encourage you to go out and search to go deeper on that topic on your own. But I do want to introduce you to the thinking and the philosophy and the principles of St. Thomas and help you understand how these principles and ideas are still very relevant today. So, go grab some Tylenol and let's get going. So St. Thomas's greatest, as I mentioned, most widely considered his greatest work is Asuma theologia. Even though it is unfinished, it is still a massive work with well over 1.8 million words. It is a summary of our theology, although 1.8 million words, it's like you can call that a summary, but it is. And it's divided in 3 parts: God and creation, the virtues and morality, and Christ and his church. Now you think this massive volume written by this incredible genius, this theological volume, would be just impossible for the average person to pick up and read. Well, some of it is kind of thick and kind of hard and kind of heavy, but some of it is not. Some of it is fairly readable. And it's not something you pick up and you start on page 1 and you read all the way through. It's not a textbook per se. The entire work follows this question-answer format. And so what you can do, what it's good to do, is that if you have a particular question or an interest in a particular topic, you would find an index, Summa Theologiae, and you would look up particular questions that you have questions about as well. And then you can read that. You don't have to read like the introduction. There are no introductions. You don't have to find a certain area to read first. You just kind of open up, find what you're looking for, and start reading the question and the answers to that. And so it is an accessible work. Some of it is more complicated, but some of it actually is not that complicated. The language is the hardest part to kind of understand, because the language of theology and the words are used, but it is accessible if you give it time, if you dig into it, if you kind of look up some of the terminology, you can read it as well. I just want to give you a format of what these questions are like in the Summa. They always start with this kind of title or this main question. I'll give an example here. I summarized, this is an actual question in the Summa, and I've summarized the actual parts of the Summa. Instead of giving you the whole thing, because it wouldn't fit on the slide, I kind of summarized each of the parts. But this is an actual kind of translation of this question. The question is, does God exist? And what happens here is that the first part, these 2 objections, would be what it says to St. Thomas. This isn't St. Thomas speaking. This is someone objecting to God existing. And there are usually 1 to 4 objections for each question. And so in this particular example, there are 2 objections. First one is, because God is infinitely good, therefore evil cannot exist. The second objection is that everything in the world can be traced back to nature or human will. Therefore, there's no need for the existence of God. So this is someone going to St. Thomas and saying, no, God does not exist, and here are my objections to why God does exist. And then the rest of it is St. Thomas's answer to it. And you always know St. Thomas' part starts because he always says, on the contrary. So when you see the on the contrary, here's St. Thomas's answer to that. On the contrary is always a very short snippet, usually a Bible verse, but it's always very short. And then he gets into the bigger answer when he says, I answer that. So he says, I answer that the existence of God can be proved in 5 ways. Now, I don't list the 5 ways because that takes up pages. But these are, if you've heard of the 5 proofs of the existence of God, that is where that lies in there. This is where St. Thomas goes into the 5 different proofs of God. Now, God the first mover, God the first cause, and things of that nature that I don't really have time to go into. But he gives his answer to the original question, does God exist? And he says, yes, I answer that the existence of God can be proved in these 5 ways. And then he addresses the particular objections. So then he says, here's my reply to objection number 1. God allows evil to exist so that good may be produced from it. And here is my reply to objection number 2. Nature and human will must be traced back to a first principle, and that first principle is God. So the Summa is just a bunch of these different questions and answers, and all these objections and replies to all these objections. And that's it. It's just very long. There are a total of 512 questions in the Summa, with about 10,000 objections and replies total. And so it is very long, it is very wordy, but I encourage you can find it online. You can get it for free on Kindle, actually, too, to kind of browse through it and find some questions that interest you and see how easy it is you can actually read it, because it's meant to be a summary of theology for normal people, for lay people. Now, later on, St. Thomas would also write a Summa of the Summa. We actually gave a summary of the summary of theology, which is a shorter version of basically this. So we're going to get into some of the more deeper topics now. Most of these do come from the Summa, but others come from other works as well. Faith and reason. So I talked about faith and reason when I talked about St. Albert the Great as well, because this was a time during this 13th century where faith and reason would start to be understood and start to come to what we understand today. Because before St. Albert the Great and St. Thomas, it was faith against reason and reason against faith, and they had no business with each other. But these 2 great saints, these 2 great doctors of the church would say, no, actually that's not true. There is no conflict between faith and reason, and they actually go hand in hand. Philosophy, and by the extension of this science, is the study of what can be observed by our natural senses, right? What we can see, hear, feel, taste. This is the study of what can be observed, and the study is unaided then by grace. It's merely our natural senses that do the observation. Theology then is the study of what is supernaturally revealed by God. Both are legitimate sciences, and they should never contradict. This is what St. Thomas was saying. They're not the same, but they are complementary as well. Now, this was groundbreaking, as mentioned, during Aquinas' time, because it was a common belief, even among people like St. Bernard, that faith did not need reason to explain it. You believed it because the Bible said so, or you believed it because that's what the Vatican says so, that's what the Catholic Church says, and so that's just why you believe it. And many people today kind of still have that attitude. And that the philosophy of these heathens, these Greek philosophers, Aristotle, Plato, don't go study them because they'll only contradict or challenge what we know as Christianity. Well, St. Thomas would say, no, that's not right. That's not true. And Aquinas would then come along with St. Albert, to prove them all wrong. And philosophers like Aristotle, through his natural observation of humans, of human interaction, of the world around him, Aristotle did discover many important truths, especially about nature and about human nature as well. But St. Thomas would say he could only go so far because he did not have the gift of divine revelation. So these Greek philosophers could take you to a point, but they can't take you beyond that. Only faith, only divine revelation, only grace can take you beyond that point, because beyond there is supernatural. So Aquinas was very instrumental in showing that faith and reason do not contradict each other. They actually work together to reveal truths. Reason can take you to observe truth to a certain point, and after that, we rely on our faith to reveal the rest, the full truth. All right, the problem of evil. So this is a really sticky one. So I'm going to try to talk this as well as I can in just a matter of minutes, and I'm probably going to confuse you all, and I apologize in advance. So the big question, why does evil exist? Did God create evil? Where did it come from? How could God create evil if he is all good? Well, no, God did not create evil. God can only create good things. In fact, evil is not really a thing at all. There is not some evil force out there manipulating, driving us, making us do things. Evil essentially is a choice made by human beings. So St. Thomas would describe evil as a privation of the good, which basically is evil is the absence of good. It's a removal of good from a good object. So when we sin, that is a privation of the good. We are good objects. We have goodness in us, but we allow sin, when we allow sin to happen, then we remove some of that good from us, and then what is left over is evil. So everything that God created is good. So we are good. So what about Satan? God created Satan. Is Satan good? Well, Satan was created as good, yes. He is, although he's a fallen angel, he is an angel. So he was created for goodness. However, God did not create Satan with the intent that he would fall. But Satan did fall from grace. Now, Satan is not technically not evil incarnate, because evil is not a thing. It cannot be incarnated. But Satan always chooses evil. He never chooses the good. So he was a good created thing that refused the good and now always chooses evil. So that explains Satan. So we, as good creations, do evil, we sin as a result of our free will. So God does not make us sin. He does not make us do evil things. We choose out of our own free will then to turn away from our good intent, to turn away from what we were created to be, and we choose to do evil. Well, the question then comes up, but if God is all-knowing, right? He knows everything. He knows our future. Then what is the point of trying to be a better person? This is kind of the idea of predestination, which the Calvinists, the Protestant group, would try to say everything is predestined because God knows everything. He already knows, even though you don't, he already knows if you're going to heaven or hell. So just continue on the path you're on because God's going to guide you either way. Anyways, it doesn't matter. But that's not true, St. Thomas would say. So if we really have free will, do we really have free will then if God is omniscient, if God is all-knowing? St. Thomas will say yes for two reasons. First, God is outside of time. What does that mean? Okay, now try to stay with me here because this can get kind of mind-blowing stuff. God created time. Time is a created thing in a way. He created it for us, for our sake. Gave us time to, draw close to God, to love him, to accept the salvation of Jesus Christ, and to redemption of our sins, to confess our sins, and to be with him in paradise. He gave us time to allow us to do that. Since it is a created thing, essentially, then God exists outside of it. He cannot be a part of his own creation. So God exists outside of time. What does that mean? Well, that means that your right here, right now, is God's right here, right now. Your future is God's right now. And your past is God's right now. So it's incorrect then to say that God knew what you're going to do before you did it, because for God there is no before. Before is now, and after is now, and now is now. He sees everything at all time, perfectly, all at once. So that's kind of, whoa, that's kind of crazy. So this is kind of mind-boggling. So there is no God knew what you were going to do because God already knew, because you already did it in the mind of God because God is outside of time. And so that's one of the ways in which free will, we still have free will in that. And God, because of the God works outside of time. Now also, God also creates then in many different ways. He doesn't just create in one way. Because he's God, he can create in any way he wants. So he created the heavens and the earth, and he created you and me. He does this by willing us into existence. He wanted Deacon Dan to exist, and so therefore I existed. I'll say Thomas calls this necessary creation, necessarily created. And the rocks, the trees, the planet Earth, the stars, the sun were all necessarily created by God. However, God can also will things to be contingently. He wills that we do good contingently. Contingent on what? What does that mean? Contingent on our free will. So he necessarily created us as inherently good, as good beings. He then sent his Son to redeem us and to bring us the good news of our salvation. He desires, God deeply desires for us to be good and to do good. So much so that he's done everything that he can to lead us to the good, except take away our free will. There's the one thing he can't do if he wants us to accept and to love and to know him. We have to make that choice to do that. And the only way we can make a choice is if God gives us free will, and God does not then infringe upon our free will. So to do this, to choose the good and reject the evil, is all up to us. So then if we do evil, it is not God's fault. If we do evil, then it is our fault. So then back to the original question is, do we really have free will if God is all-knowing? Yes, we really do, because God does not infringe upon our free will. He wills us to do the good contingently based upon our decisions via our free will. Now you can see, that's the problem of evil especially is a very difficult question. I've only barely touched the surface. I'm sure someone came along and probably refute me on some of those things easily because I don't have time to get into the nuances of it. It's a very complicated question that people are still, philosophy and theologians today are still talking about. But I just want you to get an idea of just how super complicated this question can get really quickly. All right, so a little more on that. So metaphysics. So then what is metaphysics? St. Thomas was big on metaphysics, as many of the philosophers and theologians were of his time. You might have heard this word metaphysics. What exactly does that mean? It is a study of the most fundamental aspects of being that constitutes a being. Basically, that's the question, what makes a thing the thing that it is? What is its essence? So one very simple, easy example to kind of understand the basis of metaphysics is I can ask the question, what makes a triangle a triangle? Well, so it's easy. It's an object, it's a shape with three sides, okay? So if I have something with four sides and is that a triangle? You can say, no, that's not a triangle, that's a square or a rectangle. A triangle, what makes a triangle? A triangle is a shape with three sides. I said, okay, I have a red triangle over here and a green triangle over here. Are they both triangles? Yes, because color does not determine what makes a triangle, only the number of sides. And I could say, well, I have a triangle drawn on a piece of paper here, and then I have a triangle, a musical instrument that people ring in the orchestra. I have a triangle here. Are these both triangles? You can reply and say, yes, they are both triangles because the material they are made out of doesn't matter. What matters is the shape of three sides, whether it's drawn on a page or it's a physical, actual shape, object. Okay, that's the kind of the fifth grade explanation of metaphysics. What makes a thing a thing? What makes a table a table? What makes a chair a chair? Now, obviously, Thomas was not concerned with what makes a table or a triangle a triangle. He was more concerned with bigger issues of metaphysics, things that I don't have really time to get into because it'd be way too deep. But just think of the question then: what makes a human being a human being? A little bit heavier. What makes an angel an angel? And the biggest question of all: what makes God God? What is the godness of God? If you take away certain attributes from what we know as God, then is he still God? Defining the essence of a thing, which when you talk about big things like heaven, angels, and God, the question then gets really, really hard to answer. But these are what Thomas was interested in, and this is what metaphysics was. Related to that, then, we can talk a little more about the problem of evil. Since evil, as I mentioned, and St. Thomas would say, is not a physical thing, it doesn't exist, actually. It's not a force or something we can manipulate or take control of, then it is not a part of the nature of any created thing. Evil was not created, so nature is not a part of us as a thing. So then, what is the nature of things, of all things created? St. Thomas would say, to answer that question, you look at its end goal, its end or its goal. Why do we, or anything for that matter, then exist? Why are we here? St. Thomas says all objects share one end in common: to seek, to serve, and to love God. It reminds me of the old Baltimore Catechism saying of why do we exist? To know and love and to serve God. St. Thomas would be right on board with that. Everything, even the rocks, the trees, and the animals, and this building itself, everything exists to seek, to serve, and to love God. So I don't get too much into metaphysics because you can really get down in the weeds really quickly on this one. So I want to talk about some more interesting topics that are kind of relevant to us. They're kind of easier to explain, to be quite honest. Let's talk about just war. So St. Thomas builds on the original just war theory first proposed by St. Augustine. But St. Augustine really doesn't go too much in depth in it. He just brought it up because Christians were being persecuted. And with St. Augustine's time, Rome was being invaded. And the barbarians were going through Rome and going to North Africa, where he lived as well. So the question came up is, what do Christians do in these type of situations? When someone invades your home, and someone threatens your family, do you just say, you just turn the other cheek and you just give up and say, do whatever you need to do? And St. Augustine said Christians were doing this and they were getting slaughtered. And so St. Augustine says, no, you have a right to defend yourself and defend your family against evil, which for St. Augustine's time, the 4th century, was rather revolutionary. Well, St. Thomas takes then this kind of just war theory that St. Augustine proposed, and he builds upon it. He takes it to a point where in St. Thomas's nature, in his way, he codified it. He laid out the ground rules of a just war. When can a war be justified? So the first question is, can war ever be justified? Aquinas would say yes, absolutely, under certain conditions. We Christians, we Catholics, we're not pacifists. Just there is conditions in which a war can be justified. St. Thomas laid out 3 conditions that must be met before you can say this is a just war. The first is there must be a just cause. Whether that cause is protection of the people, a right to what has been stolen from the people or from a country, or to combat oppression or some form of evil. Things like vengeance, revenge, and greed are not just causes. The second one is that it must be declared by a just authority, and that leaders of nations and not terrorists or warlords can call war, can declare war. And finally, it must be fought with just intent. You can only fight to restore justice. Once justice has been restored, the fighting must cease. You cannot, once you beat the enemy, then totally beat them down by then invading their country, then taking over their people at that time. You cannot beat the enemy when they're already down, when they've already surrendered. And so these are codified. This is what we use today. And actually, at the beginning of the first Gulf War, 91, 92, George H. Bush, when he laid out, we're going to war with Iraq, and this is why, he actually went through these three causes, and he listed them in his speech about why we're going to war, showing that what he was doing was a just war. This is back when Iraq invaded Kuwait. And so he was right in justifying the war at that time because he had proof, he had backup through St. Thomas's just war theory. There's a problem with war, though, even just wars. And that problem is what happens when innocent civilians die? Is the war still just at that point? And it's almost impossible these days to have war, and even Thomas's time to have war and not have innocent lives perish. Some might say the war can never be just because war involves the death of innocent civilians. Now, St. Thomas will say this is a very valid concern, and all nations must strive to avoid the death of innocent people in war as much as possible. However, sometimes it is not possible. Let me give you an example. During that Gulf War in the 90s, 2 stealth fighters bombed a bunker in Iraq. And this bunker was the command center of all Iraqi military operations. Unfortunately, there were also many civilians in the bunker to stay away from the bombs. And so they all died as well. So then the question comes up, was the bombing of that bunker, was it justified? Although it knocked out the command center for the Iraqi forces, many innocent people were killed as well. So the question is, was what we did, the bombing of the bunker, right? Was it justified? To answer that question, St. Thomas then developed this principle of double effect, which I think, given the time I have, I'm going to pretty much focus now on the double effect because it's a fascinating principle and it's very relevant in our world today. The principle of double effect basically says that a moral act can have good and bad results, but just because a moral act has a bad result or a bad effect does not necessarily mean that moral act is bad. If you have a friend, you and your friend are walking down the street and a man comes up out of the shadows and he attacks you with a knife. You just happen to be a black belt in karate, and so when the guy approaches you, you take him down with a roundhouse kick to the head. You did the morally right thing, protecting yourself and your friend, but you did a morally wrong thing by injuring another person. So is what you did then wrong? Of course not. You defended yourself. But in your act of goodness, there was a bad effect in that you injured someone else. So then St. Thomas says for a moral act then to be considered good, there are certain criteria to it. First of all, the act itself cannot be intrinsically wrong. What are you trying to do? Is it a good act? The second thing is that the person acting then, doing the thing, intends only the good effect and would avoid the bad effect if possible. So you're doing something, you only want the good effect, but by doing the good effect, there are some bad effects that happen as well, and they're unavoidable. The third criteria is the good effect cannot be caused because of the bad effect. This basically means the ends do not justify the means. You don't do a bad effect so that you have a good effect as a result of it. The fourth one is the good effect must be in proportion to the bad effect. If the results of the bad effect are way higher than the results of the good effect, that is not a morally good act. But if the results of the good effect are way higher than the results of the bad effect, then that can be a good action. Now, there's a lot to this, and I kind of went through that very quickly. So I'm going to give you a couple examples to kind of help you understand the double effect. Now, why do we use this? Actually, we use this double effect a lot in our lives. Most moral decisions we make, at least many of them, are decisions of double effect. We have a decision to do something good, but many times there are side effects of that action that are not so good. This principle of double effect comes up a lot during what we call medical ethics, these medical decisions in our lives. End-of-life issues are very heavily double effect. Questions of pain. If someone is dying, pain management becomes a big double effect question. Questions of euthanasia, which always is wrong, because it's a double effect in the opposite way. So I'll talk about double effect can be morally good. Double effect can be morally bad as well. And so euthanasia is one of these bad moral acts that has this double effect to it. Fertility treatments, another way, most of those are bad moral acts, but have potentially good side effects to them. And then pharmaceuticals, drugs, drug interactions, drug symptoms. When are the side effects of a drug too great for what the drug is trying to cure? So these are questions of that double effect as well. So let me give a very common example that a lot of us deal with when we deal with end-of-life issues. So let's say you have a dying person there, maybe a dying parent or dying friend or something like that, and they're suffering, they're in pain, but they're also not going to make it. Whatever their condition is, it is eventually going to kill them. But it may be a long, drawn-out sickness, and in the meantime, they're suffering. And so we give drugs to alleviate the pain. Well, these pain medications, unfortunately, many of them have a side effect of hastening the death of the individual. So even though the primary purpose of the drug is to relieve the pain, that is the morally good intent of the drug, there is a bad side effect, which is it hastens the death of the person. So, do we give the pain medication? Is it morally right then to give this pain medication to a person, knowing that it will relieve the pain or cause some comfort, but it will cause them to die sooner? Now, that's where we bring in the 4 points of the double effect. And the first point is this a good action? Is the action good? Yes, because relieving of pain is a morally good action. So first one, we could say yes. The second question, go back real quickly. So is the act intended only the good effect and would avoid the bad effect impossible? So are we only intending to relieve the pain? Or are we intending to hasten the death of the individual? And this is where questions of euthanasia kind of pop in, is that why is the doctor giving this pain medication? Is he truly concerned for the patient's well-being, or is he trying to just hurry up to death so he can have the bed free so he can put someone else in it? These are real questions, and these are real things to consider. So intending to relieve pain but not hasten death must be the intention for this to be a morally good act. The third question then, the good effect cannot be caused because of the bad effect. So the only reason that the secondary effect of hastening the death can be tolerated is because the person is already dying and near death. So we should never give a drug again that may hasten the death for relatively minor illnesses. So basically, we know that this drug hastens death, but this person is already on their deathbed and doesn't have long to live. So the effects of bad are way less than if this was a perfectly healthy person with a minor illness. Then we definitely cannot give that drug to that person because that will hasten their death of a perfectly healthy person. So in this question of death, this is a positive thing. The ends do not justify the means in this case. So then the last question is then, the good effect must be in proportion to the bad. So the only reason that the second effect can be tolerated in this case is because this person, is going to die eventually anyway. And so in this case, we can say, yes, giving the pain medication for a dying person, which hastens the person's death, is good. Why? Because the good effects, relieving pain, is lower in proportion to the bad effects, which is hastening someone who is already near death as well. And so we give them what little time they have left. We try to give them comfort to make them feel better. Now, if we were giving the drug with the intention of quickening, hastening, bringing death quicker to this person, because whatever heinous reason we might have, then that would be a morally wrong decision. But if we're truly concerned about the patient's well-being, if we want them to have as much comfort as possible in their final moments, then we give the drug. So this is one very common example, and you see how medical ethics in this question can easily come up. And we have these just moral decisions we have to make, especially with end-of-life issues and things of that nature. However, let me give you a very pertinent example, and something that is relevant actually to each and every one of us today, right here, right now. We all have a moral question we all must answer that has a double effect principle with it. That is the COVID-19 vaccine. So in case you don't know, all of the vaccines we have currently available, the Pfizer, the Moderna, and now soon the Johnson & Johnson, all of these drugs were used, we call aborted fetal cell lines. So there was abortion back in 1968, used for medical purposes, and now even today, many drug companies in developing vaccines then use cells originally created from that aborted fetus and use these cells either in production and testing or things of that nature. And so within these vaccines, and they all use these cells in some way, there is a cooperation with evil in abortion used to create them. So this is where I open up, and you find my can of worms because I'm about to open it up and open up this big topic because it is a hot topic right now. And I'm going to disagree with a certain bishop on this and probably many Catholics out there as well. But I'm just giving you what St. Thomas would say in answer to this question, or how I perceive St. Thomas would answer this question. And so is it morally good, morally right to receive the COVID-19 vaccine, knowing at this time that they all cooperate at some level with the act of abortion? Well, ask yourself the 4 questions. Is receiving the vaccine a good act? Well, yes, it is, because we greatly prevent the vaccine within us, and then we want everyone to receive the vaccine because there is talk that it may actually prevent transmission. And then if we get it, our severity of disease, the severity of illness is very, very low, and a good chance that we may not become sick at all. And so receiving the vaccine is a good act because it reduces pain, it reduces stress, and allows the society, a majority of us or a lot of us get the vaccine, to open back up again, and we can go away from social distancing and masks and get back to the way things were as much as possible. So yes, receiving the vaccine is a good act. What is my intent in receiving the vaccine? Well, my intent is not to get COVID-19, or if I get it, then I won't become severely sick and have to be hospitalized and things of that nature. And so my intent then is good. I don't want to get the vaccine. I can't really think of a bad intent you can have for having the COVID-19 vaccine, except maybe you steal the vaccine from someone else, but that's kind of far-fetched. But so, yes, the intent of receiving the vaccine is good. So here's the sticky question then. Am I causing more abortion? Am I contributing to abortion then by receiving the vaccine? I think this is what people get stuck on with it. They think if I receive the vaccine, I am approving of, I'm contributing to the heinous, the evil act of abortion. And this is where people get tricked up on. But you have to remember, several things. First of all, Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, they're not aborting babies to create vaccines. In the vaccine itself, there is no aborted fetuses actually within the vaccine. They use the fetal cell lines. They use these for testing, for production, but they're not actually part of the vaccine itself. And what they use is not, again, goes way back to that original abortion in 1968. And no additional children, no additional babies were aborted after that to support these current vaccines. And so the question is, well, am I, saying abortions are okay in this matter? Well, we have to look at the other way too, is that there are no alternatives at this time. The only vaccines we have right now use these fetal cell lines in some way. And so the question then becomes, do the ends justify the means? And that, quite honestly, St. Thomas would say no, because you look at the proportion then of the good effect to the bad effect. What is the good effect? Well, that we all become vaccinated, and your vaccination could potentially save a loved one's life. Their vaccination could potentially save their life, the lives of those they come in contact with. And so if you are fully vaccinated, then you are less likely to transmit the disease, in theory, but you're also less likely to die and then cause suffering to your family and others as well. And so the good effect of the vaccine is that people live, and people do not become severely sick and cause detriment to others. The bad effect is that, yes, we do still use a line from the fetal tissue of a baby, once aborted. And so, but St. Thomas would say the good outweighs the evil in this line. And so it is morally a good act then to receive the COVID-19 vaccination. Now, make no doubt about it, by receiving the vaccination, you are in a very, very remote way then cooperating with the evil of abortion. Because, you are, in a way saying that you're accepting of the fetal cell line tissues being used in the production of the vaccine. But we have no alternative, and the moral good outweighs the moral evil. But there is that side effect of evil tied to it. But we accept the vaccine knowing that the good greatly outweighs the evil in it. But it's not a perfectly morally correct thing to do. But at our times we have nothing we can do about it. Now the USCCB and both the Vatican, Rome, and the USCCB have both come out in support of the COVID-19 vaccine, considering it an act of love and that it is the morally good thing to do, even though there is this association with abortion tied to it, because we have no other options. The only other option is to not receive the vaccine at all. At that case, in that point, then you have the moral obligation to not be, to continue social distancing, to continue the masking, continue the sanitization until the COVID-19 vaccine, coronavirus basically goes away or becomes no longer dangerous to people, which how long that is, I don't know. And so we want, so the Catholic Church says it is morally correct and morally good then to receive the vaccine if you wish to do so. So acceptance of the COVID-19 vaccines is morally permissible because there are no other vaccines available that do not have this. Now, if another vaccine comes along that did not contribute to abortion, to these fetal cell lines, then receiving that vaccine, if it is available to you, would be the only correct moral action. But we don't have that option right now. And again, realize that there is a very remote material cooperation in the evil of abortion by accepting the vaccine. However, the good far outweighs the evil in this. Okay? So, anytime someone says I'm nursing the COVID-19 vaccine because it contributes to abortion, you might want to say, well, if you looked at the moral good of this, if you investigated how the fetal cell line tissues were actually used in production of the vaccine, and actually, this This is an ongoing problem. This is not a new vaccine that first used this for the first time. We've been using these vaccines for a long time that have all used these fetal cell lines. And so it's a very difficult question to answer. So hopefully I've kind of give you a little bit more understanding of the controversy going on in this. And I give you perspective also as I would perceive how I think St. Thomas Aquinas would answer this question, given his principle of double effect, where you must look at the intention of the moral act and then make a judgment call as to whether the good outweighs the evil, and is the action then good? All right, so I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to talk about natural law, but the slides are available, or a PDF if you want to. But just know that St. Thomas Aquinas was heavily involved in natural law, which greatly influenced our human rights code today. Human rights is used by the United Nations and nations around the world with the basic premise that people are basically good people and our common good is written on our hearts. This all goes back to St. Thomas Aquinas. It also goes into politics. When we talk about just and unjust laws, all of this goes back to St. Thomas Aquinas, who first brought these up and described them in detail. So I just want to conclude. So in conclusion, the influence of St. Thomas the Great in this world today, from his time all the way up to today, you just cannot underestimate it. His influence is all over the place in every genre, in every area of our lives. St. Thomas is there. Declaration of Independence, St. Thomas. Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter to Birmingham jail, he talks about an unjust law is no law at all. Boom, that's St. Thomas. What's his name? Henry David Thoreau and civil disobedience. Boom, that's St. Thomas. St. Thomas is everywhere. His writings have impacted so many different things. And that, especially, I don't have time to go into it all, but St. Thomas is just everywhere. And so his influence on Catholic Church doctrine, which I have no time to get into a whole lot, but I did talk about it some, his teachings are unmatched. In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, St. Thomas is referenced 61 times. And he's referenced more than any other person, any other theologian in the Catholic Church. And so, and also he's everywhere. If you've ever gone to benediction, to adoration, and we do the opening song, O Salutaris Hostia, and at the end we do that Tantum Ergo Sacramentum, they both were written by St. Thomas. Yes, he's everywhere. You can't avoid him, which is a great thing because he's a wonderful, beautiful saint, and we're very fortunate and we're very glad to have him in our church and in our lives. So, not too shabby for a dumb ox, which is what he was called at the time. So, I want to wrap up. I'm going to give you two prayers. So, I'm not going to go into the first prayer, but this is one of my favorite prayers because this is a student's prayer. Whenever I start to study, whenever I start to begin to prepare for these talks, especially, whenever I'm starting with my studies, I always read this prayer from St. Thomas Aquinas. And so if you're an RE teacher or a Catholic school teacher, I encourage you to, or if you're a student especially, I encourage you to then read this prayer, pray this prayer to your class, to yourself before you begin your homework and things of that nature. And it's really just a beautiful prayer for those teachers and students and all those in the arts. Finally, it's just a different closing prayer for you as well that I think we're going to close with tonight. Looking for it. I lost it. Okay, I'll just pray from the slide. So I'll just pray in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So grant, O merciful God, that I may ardently desire, carefully examine, truly know, and perfectly fulfill those things that are pleasing to you, and to the praise and glory of your holy name. Direct my life, O my God, and grant that I may know what you would have me to do, and for me to fulfill it as is necessary and profitable to my soul. May I seek to please no one, and to fear to displease anyone, save only you. And finally, grant me, O Lord my God, a mind to know you, diligence to seek you, and wisdom to find you. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So thank you for joining me tonight. I apologize for going a little bit over. but I felt it's important to kind of dig in. So hopefully I didn't frizz your brains too much, and now you can rest a little while and take it easy. So thank you all, and good night.